Hi everyone, this is Christy Smeriglio, and in this series I am answering your questions regarding my writing, regarding my latest novel, Falling to Fire, and just a few of the questions that have come up in talking about my work. So today I wanted to discuss societal conventions and biological factors that played a role in my story. Now, these are factors that I do not talk about directly in my story. I kind of touch upon it lightly in the introduction, but it is something that is an underlying theme of my story. And, it's related to the question, how much of my Hispanic background made an impact on some of the decisions that I made while these events were happening to me. So this potentially could be a very long video, but I'm going to touch upon it lightly for this one, kind of like an introduction. So what it really comes down to, at least the experience was for me. So I am of Cuban descent. I also have some Italian running in my blood, but my culture, I was raised Cuban. So that was the primary culture in my household, even though I was born in Miami, and so was my mom. But the Cuban influence was strong. So something that I noticed, and I didn't really realize it until I was writing this book, how much of an impact that really had. But, sorry, no one wants to get up. Gigi. Hey, baby. So one of the things that I noticed was that even though there was a lot of conversation, like you should wait to date, you're not gonna have a boyfriend, school is the most important thing. At the same time, you would then go to these family functions and you would hear el novio, and the boyfriend, or, questions about who am I talking to, if I was dating anybody, if anybody had any interest in me, or if I had any interest in anybody. And I didn't realize it at that point, but being asked these questions already kind of prompted something within me, right? Because these adults, right, these authority figures are asking me these questions. And so they're there in the back of my mind. And then at the same time, being a young person, then you have these biological urges that start to appear, your own longings. You want to start to connect to people, whether it's in a relationship capacity or with friends. But definitely I felt more the sense of wanting to pair off, and then I felt these pressures, like I said, like very subtle pressures, and these conflicting messages of, oh, don't get a boyfriend, focus on school. But are you talking to anybody? And so I realized that did have a heavy influence. I was even asked questions by my parents, and questions, let's say, coming from my mom, about just my preferences and things like that. Being asked those questions at a young age, of course, I look back and there were no bad intentions on anybody's part asking me these questions, but I realized that because I was having a hard time making friends, having any interest, any male attention in that way, like in a nice, well-intentioned way, because I was struggling, having these questions being thrown at me just felt worse. It made me feel bad, and it kind of gave me this pressure, and then people around me were having boyfriends. I mean, even in middle school, a lot of the people around me started dating, and they had their first kisses and things like that. And those were just experiences that I wasn't having. A lot of the feelings that I had felt were not reciprocated. And I struggled a lot with my connections with people in middle school and then in high school. So I realized that there was this underlying factor, so in my case, I am speaking about the female experience, but in talking to other people, I do feel like there's also then the male experience, that needs to be talked about. I struggle with my story, and just tagging it as this abuse story, because there's a lot to unpack there. These were men that I was interested in. I mean, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that any of the abusive behaviors were right in any way. Consent is something very important that needs to be talked about. But in some of these more like gray areas where maybe not, lines weren't. There were a couple moments that even if something sexual didn't happen, and it was just attempted, I feel like there's something to be said about these underlying pressures on both sides. Do I feel like these men in my life had such horrible intentions? Not really, no. There were a few that, if you want to talk about specifics, yes, there were some bad intentions there, and those would be, those abusive moments in my past. But a lot of what I touch on in the story are these attempts, these kind of rude comments, rude requests. And, I try to understand the factors on both sides, right? So on my end, I'm trying to build a relationship. I'm trying to get interest from this person. Very misguided. We understand this, but, trying to look back and understand the mind of a very young woman. And then I try to think about the male perspective, and a lot of the men that I've talked to, they've talked about this pressure to be a man, to provide. And, it's interesting because at least in Cuban families that I've seen, or just in general, there's a lot of this like rite of passage for the men, even as teenagers, where like some people even, they get introduced to intoxicating substances, into being with women at a young age. And there's a lot of this talk of conquests and, get with as many girls as you can, but like, if the girl's too easy, like, don't make her your girlfriend. Like, there's a lot of communication that's being thrown in either direction. And I feel like that kind of pressure causes a lot of misguided action to come from both parts, when really I feel like the focus should be on just seeing if there's a connection or not. If there's a connection, fantastic, it'll work out. When there's too much thought behind it, and should I get with this girl, but she's too easy, and I need to act this way in order to make my boyfriend, like all this crap, this bullshit. It's like, looking back, I'm like, wow, why were we focused on that? And I think that there is this heavy, societal pressure, biological pressure, to make these relationships happen at a certain point. I felt that, and it seems, like I said, like it's coming from both sides. In my story specifically, I touch on, like I said, the female experience of it, at least one female's experience with it. And I may not touch heavily in the fantasy part of the story. I may not touch heavily on these societal factors, but it is an underlying theme as Priella is trying to process this need to pair off, this longing to pair off, but at the same time trying to make something work with someone that's not meant for her. I've known people that even, they've been in relationships and then they get pregnant at a young age. And then sometimes, the pressure is, okay, we got to marry that person, even if that person's not the right person for them, or there was abuse present in the relationship, but it was like this intent to make it work. Just like, you have sex with somebody, okay, well then there has to be a relationship there. There's like this constant need to justify, this constant need to have these transactions. And I think that that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of hoopla, really, but it's a lot of pressure, especially to be putting on a young person when, young people are still trying to navigate, this is us trying to navigate, right? And when these extra pressures are mounting on us while we're in school and we're trying to just pass classes and make friends and see where we belong. Do we belong in this group? Do we belong to a group at all? What are our interests? There's a lot happening in those years. And I think it's just very important to be mindful of both sides to that story and how to best empower ourselves at any age, really, whether it is a young person or it is an adult, how to empower ourselves to make wise choices, to be aware of the choices that we're making, to be aware of what are those pressures, those, whether it's an emotional block, a trauma, a societal pressure, a biological instinct, what are these factors that are fueling our decisions. And by asking ourselves these questions, we're able to make more informed decisions. So those are just a few of the themes that I have realized are present within my story, underneath it. And it's kind of a lens through which we can take a look at Priella's decisions and how this is one way that those pressures can impact a young, impressionable woman who is struggling. So that's just one of the things that I didn't notice in my story. And it is very interesting to see, at least from a Hispanic woman's perspective, a Cuban woman's perspective specifically, because I know in talking to other Hispanics, their experiences were slightly different. There were a little different nuances, but it does seem that there is societal pressures present in the Hispanic culture when it comes to these relationships. So like I said, a little bit just an introduction to that, but I definitely think this is something that needs to be talked about because, like I said, whether it is we are a young person or an adult, it's very important for us to be mindful of our decisions. So anyways, that's just one of my themes in my story that is underlining the work. So just wanted to answer that question. If you guys have any other questions, or if you want to add to this discussion, I would love to dive deeper into this discussion and hear from you guys, whether you're Hispanic or you have another, you're from another culture. What was your experience growing up? Were those pressures present, in regards to getting into relationships at a young age? What were the biological urges you felt? What is it that you wanted? And what you wanted, was it aligned with the experiences that you were having? Was there anything interfering in that? I am curious to know, and I would love to have this discussion with you guys. Other than that, if you have any other questions, I would love to hear from you as well. I see this work, Falling into Fire, it is a standalone work, but I do see it as a conversation piece to talk about some of these heavier topics. So I definitely welcome this conversation. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening and look forward to more.